How can you use custom hooks in React? And what are some kind of key points regarding custom hooks to consider? Well, first, let's look at just kind of an example of how you might use them and kind of what you might use them for. And then we'll kind of get into the key points here towards the end. So I have this example where I fetch data from the JSON placeholder API to render out a list of posts here. And then also if I click on to-dos, it's going to render out this list of to-dos. If I click on users, it renders out this list of users. So I have pretty similar logic in all three of these cases to where I'm fetching from the JSON placeholder API, but really the only thing that changes is the endpoint that I'm getting this data from. So when you have some logic that is similar and kind of repeats itself, you might want to turn that into a function, just like you would when using a function any other time in programming. You create a function that encapsulates some logic so you no longer have to repeat yourself and you can just use that function throughout your program. That's the same thing you're doing with custom hooks in React. You are creating a function that encapsulates some React logic so you can reuse it throughout your application. Now, if we look at this example, our homepage renders out this placeholder list here. If we go to the placeholder list, you can see that here it calls use placeholder data, which is our custom hook. It passes in a data type, and this data type is set based on, in our homepage, what button we select. So if we select users or to-dos or posts here in this array, that's going to set the selected data type. It's going to pass that to the placeholder list, and then I'm going to call my use placeholder data custom hook with that data type to retrieve the data. And then if we go to our actual custom hook here, what you're going to see is that basically it's just a React function that uses or encapsulates some other React features. So it uses other React hooks in this function. If it didn't use like use effect and use state within use placeholder data, well, you wouldn't need to create a custom hook for it. You could just create a regular JavaScript utility function and then share that utility function throughout your application. But since we are using other React features here, like use state and use effect, well, in that case, since we are encapsulating actual React features, we want to create this in a custom hook. So basically, we have a async function here that fetches data from the JSON placeholder API, depending on the passed in endpoint. It's either going to be posts, to-dos, or users to match our posts, to-dos, or users. We're going to check if the response is okay, do a little bit of error handling here, handle some loading state. But then if all goes well, we're going to set the result. And then from this custom hook, all we need to do here is we need to return information or data that we want to actually consume from this hook. So what would we actually want to know from this use placeholder data hook? Well, we'd of course want the data itself. That's kind of a given. But we'd also probably want to know the loading as well as the error state. So when I call this hook in my placeholder list component, I automatically destructure the data, the loading, as well as the error state. I check for those here, and then I render out the result. And the reason that this could be useful is, in this case, I'm only rendering one placeholder list component. So I'm not calling this use placeholder data custom hook several times throughout my application. But you could imagine that I could have separate places in my application that would want to use this hook and pass in either posts, to-dos, or users, or even any other endpoints to this URL. And then I could reuse this logic. We could even make this a little bit more general if we wanted, but you also want to be careful about not making these too general, as we'll get to that in just a second. Now, there are some key points to remember when it comes to custom hooks. So I'm going to go to my key points page. And the first key point is that custom hooks, as I kind of alluded to, let you share reusable logic. So instead of repeating logic in multiple components, you can extract it into a custom hook. For example, if multiple components need to fetch user data, you can create a hook called use user data, so they all share the same logic. Now, even on top of this, I would say custom hooks, it's not only about sharing logic, but it's about sharing React specific logic. So sharing logic that needs to use other React features like use state, use ref, use effect, stuff like that. Because like I said, if we didn't have any React features in here, so like other React hooks, we would just create a regular JavaScript function and that would be totally fine to do. So you only need to create a custom hook when you are going to be using other React features inside that hook. Now you need to make sure that you always call custom hooks in the top level. So custom hooks, they mimic React hooks to where A, they must be called in the top level, and then B, they also need to start with the use prefix. So here you see it's called use placeholder data. It is not called get placeholder data or something else like that. Custom hooks need to start with the lowercase use prefix, just like React hooks do. So it needs to follow the same convention of like use state, use effect, use ref, use placeholder data, use user data. It needs to start with that use prefix. And then from that use prefix, it's going to be JavaScript camel case. So similar to how use state is a lowercase use, capital S for state, kind of this camel case. It's going to be the same thing with like use placeholder data. And then it also needs to be called at the top level of your function. So similar to when you're using use state or use effect, we can't call this stuff after like any if statements or anything like that within the body of our component. So when we call use placeholder data within placeholder list, it happens right at the top level of our component here. It cannot occur below like these if statements right here that would cause issues. It needs to be at the top level, just like any other React hook. So it mentions here, just like built-in hooks, custom hooks need to be called at the top level of another component or of another hook. You can call hooks within hooks, but they cannot be inside loops, conditions, or nested functions. For example, don't put use fetch data inside an if statement. It always must be called in the main body of the component or other hook. Additionally, custom hooks only share logic, not state. So each component that calls a hook gets its own isolated state. Hooks don't share state across components unless you use global state management. For example, if two components use a custom use counter hook, they each have their own independent counters. They wouldn't share that counter state. So really, custom hooks are meant for encapsulating logic. They're not meant to be like a global state management tool to where you're trying to like share the same state throughout your application. Like each component that uses your custom hook is going to get their own instance of individual state, encapsulated kind of state. You shouldn't be trying to use custom hooks to like implement global state management. You're going to use something like context, or you're going to be using some other global state management tool. I particularly don't love context, so I'd probably use some other global state management tool, but custom hooks are for sharing logic. Also, don't create overly generic hooks like use mount. Hooks should have clear purpose instead of like a generic runs on mount hook. Make one that solves a specific problem. For example, instead of use mount, create a use fetch on mount hook that fetches data only when the component first loads. So your custom hooks, they shouldn't be overly generic. They should kind of solve specific issues throughout your application. And then also with custom hooks, decide when to break logic into separate hooks. So similar to this one, it's kind of up to you how to organize hooks. If one hook is doing too much, break it down into smaller single-purpose hooks. For example, if a hook handles both authentication and data fetching, split it into a use auth and a use API custom hook. So split it into two. So you don't want them to be too general, and you don't want them to like solve too many separate problems within the same hook. It's kind of helpful to make them into their own kind of pure, reusable custom hooks. So to recap here, you can create custom hooks in React, but you need to treat them like any other React hook, meaning it has to start with the use prefix. It must be called at the top level of a component or another hook. So for example, when we call our use placeholder data within our placeholder list, we cannot call it after these if statements here. It would have to come before it. So it needs to be called at the top level of a component or another hook. And then in your custom hook, you're going to be using other React features or other React hooks. If you don't use any other React features, you don't really need a custom hook for that. You can just create a regular JavaScript function. But if you do want to share some React specific logic, like use state, use effects, stuff like that, then you can create a custom hook to do so. Now, when doing that, you want to make sure that you create a specific hook. You don't make it too generalized. And you want to make sure that it's kind of solving one issue. So here we're solving the issue of just fetching data from our JSON placeholder API. But we don't make it too terribly generic here to where it's trying to solve a bunch of kind of unrelated issues all in the same custom hook. And then generally, I would say, don't get carried away with custom hooks. Like after learning this, it can be tempting to create a custom hook for like all of your React logic, but just make sure, just like with, putting stuff into JavaScript functions, make sure that you're actually reusing it in probably multiple places throughout your application, and make sure that you have like a really good use case for it, because it can be kind of tricky to track all of your custom hooks within your application over time, especially on a team of a lot of developers and a large application. You can run into issues like that. So I would say, they can be helpful for sure. And they do have their use cases, but they are kind of like an escape hatch, so to speak, to where it's like, okay, I'm really reusing this kind of same React logic over and over throughout my application. That's when you want to use this custom hook. Hopefully you learned something from this. Thanks for tuning into it, and I'll see you in that next one.